right, so as you can tell, we are talking about just transitions, and in particular, I'm looking to draw on some global experiences on coal phase out and see where, what or how these experiences might help inform coal transition or decarbonization in India specifically. I've looked at some of the past past speakers like Sandeep Pai and Dr. Naidu from South Africa recently. And I didn't really purposefully want to repeat a lot of what they'd said, because they're obviously experts in the field. So I thought, let me try something that complements what they've already talked about, and hopefully further, our collective thinking around just transitions. But before I start, can I please acknowledge country where I sit? So I'd like to acknowledge both the Turrbal and the Jagara peoples as the traditional custodians on this land from where I'm attending the meeting today. I recognize their ongoing connections to land, waters, and community, and I pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging. Okay, so this is how I've structured the talk. I will really only spend the first just a couple of minutes to set the context. So sections 1 and 2 is what you've already, better than I do actually, and you already have heard a number of speakers in the past talk about this. But I'm just going to really briefly touch on that to set the context for the rest of the conversation. The focus, as I said, is on section 3, which is the global experience around managing the social aspects of coal transition. And then there are some recommendations that come out of that naturally, but then, and hopefully those recommendations can trigger us to think a little bit more strategically around what can India learn indeed from those experiences. So the problem context. So obviously there is there's an energy dilemma in India. It's going to be or likely to be the most populous country this decade. It's also has young population. It's a fast growing economy, rapid urbanization, and a rising middle class, all of which point to a global, a rising demand nationally for energy. Just as an example, in the last 20 years, energy consumption has more than doubled alone in India. And in the next 40 years, it's likely to experience, as a country, the largest increase in energy demand globally. So that directly deals, segues into then where is the coal dilemma and how does coal fit into all of that? So India's CO2 emissions are already comparable with that of the European Union's. By 2050, which it is likely to double. And in the next 2 decades, India is also going to overtake the US and become the second largest emitter after China. Now, where obviously, as you would know, where coal sits in is that more than 40% of India's primary energy demand is met by coal. So it's so kind of, you know all of this anyway. So let's not spend any more time than is absolutely necessary here. But it just kind of tells us the gravity of the situation and why we are all talking about energy transition in India. So obviously we know that India's coal phase out is integral to its energy transition. Just for the purposes of this talk, I wanted to, if you see on the top right, I've put it in a box, which is whether it's a phase out or a phase down. So there's been a lot of debate around this. I don't personally believe that there is, there's one right or there's any right or wrong answer for the matter. I think in some regions or in some cases within India, it might be a phase out situation. In other cases and for other regions, it might be phased down. So it's certainly not a question of if, but it's only a matter of when. So therefore, there's an underlying temporal dimension which we must recognize and acknowledge as we talk about energy transition. But I just wanted to set that sort of almost a disclaimer that for the rest of this talk, I am referring to phase out, not phase down, but it's mostly because the examples that I've brought along from the global experiences are all mostly around phasing out. So I just thought to keep consistency, it would be helpful to continue to use the word phase out. So having clarified that, we know that there are very strong economic, ecological, and industrial incentives for national and regional governments to support the phase out of coal. What we don't know very much of, or is the question around, well, what are the likely social impacts likely to be from implementing some of those incentives? And that's the space, I think, that a lot still needs to be done. And collectively, as a research community, there is space for us to address this question from different angles. And that's the question that I find most of interest as a social scientist. So yeah, so what are likely to be the key social impacts of the full range of economic, environmental, and industrial incentives that our national and regional governments in India are already putting in place? And that question is really critical because we know that energy transition is not really a unidimensional sort of techno-economic challenge. You know, in many ways, any sort of transition from large industrial activity is quite a societal issue. But knowing that, we still really have a long way to go in understanding what are the impacts, what are the social impacts of these transitions likely to be. So that's kind of the, how I'm approaching this problem. Now, what is just transitions? And to understand what are the likely social impacts, just transitions is a really strong, almost an agenda. I'd like to call it an agenda rather than a concept, because, and the reason is because as we understand the scale of the challenge, and therefore we know that rapid decarbonization is necessary and that an accelerated top-down decarbonization process is important, but it remains quite a risky pursuit. It might be effective in facilitating long-term commitments, particularly resource commitment, and outcomes in technology development or adoption. But in that focus on pace, there is a chance that inadvertently we might pay poor attention to the process of how we achieve that. And that then leads us to think about potential compromise around issues on equity, procedural fairness, and social legitimacy. And so that really is why just transitions is a powerful sort of an ambition or an aspiration. So what is it? My understanding is that it's not a set blueprint. There is no one way of achieving just transition, but it's more an ambition or an aspiration. It is an all-encompassing approach, which builds on the principles of, some known narratives in the fields of energy justice and climate justice, but some recently emerging narratives on energy justice. So it encompasses environmental justice, climate justice, and energy justice. And it impacts the full suite of energy transitions. So it's not just about, well, what happens to regions and communities which have long been dependent on coal as the primary economic activity. It also is very much about, well, what happens at the other end of the spectrum as companies and countries and regions begin to rapidly scale up renewable energy development projects. There are issues around land conflict, or land use conflict, issues over water conflict. So just transitions looks at the full suite of energy transitions, including coal phase out, as well as greater extraction of minerals and metals necessary for that transition, for clean energy development. So far, just transition, there are a number of sentiments that it evokes. It calls for issues like fair compensation for workers, for reskilling and retraining to be able to allow them to be employed in new jobs, environmental restoration, land rehabilitation, but also long-term social revitalization. But in the way we are approaching it at the Center for Social Responsibility in Mining, where I work, we believe that it offers a really strong potential to demarginalize groups and communities that have historically been vulnerable to political and socioeconomic abuse. So in doing that, it almost offers the potential to sort of facilitate the application of the UN guiding principles on business and human rights. So it's quite broad. It runs the risk of becoming vague, but it does have some powerful. It evokes some powerful ambitions and aspirations, and therefore is helpful in further teasing out where are the risks and where are the constraints around energy transition, both out of coal but into more renewable energy development. So like I said, this is just sort of, this is the diagram that you see here is kind of built around the 3 pillars of social resilience, ecological integrity, and economic sustainability. And then the outer circle is more, the focus is more around the process of achieving it. So it has to be inclusive and participatory. It has to, be respectful of human rights. It's, as I said, there's no one blueprint, so it has to be quite context specific. Has to have a long-term vision and one that complements existing policies and does not stand in isolation from what else is happening around nationally or regionally. So the way we are approaching it at UQ is that we want to very specifically look at it as a medium or as a source of transition that considers impacts beyond job losses. It is not just about jobs. And I'll talk about that in a moment. We're also really interested in understanding the whole supply chains. So not just a particular coal mining asset or a particular coal-fired power plant. We want to look at closure or the presence or absence of the industry, of the coal industry in its entirety, and not be limited or constrained by a singular asset. So how does it impact the region in which that asset is located? So the sectors that may be indirectly dependent on it. And again, we'll talk about these in more detail. And we also recognize that the nature and magnitude of social impacts will vary across scale and geography, but also across time frame. In some cases that I'll present, there has been almost an unplanned shock that has come as a result of a closure. So how does that lead to different or varied impacts compared to where there have been quite gradual and planned transitions? So there's a whole level of diversity around how those impacts manifest on the ground. Right. So with that background on just transition, let's jump into some of the experiences. So I have, in our work, we have looked at 5 key regions. I'm going to talk about 4 of them. So there's the UK, Germany, so going from left to right, the UK, Germany, Poland, Australia, and the US. So I'm going to talk about the 4. So I'm going to talk about 4 of these, excluding the UK, just in the interest of time. Right, so let's begin with Germany. So Germany has had a long history of coal mining. At its peak, it employed over 600,000 people. And most of this mining was quite localized. It was in 2 key areas, the Ruhr region and Saarland. And together, these 2 regions produced over 130 million tons per year. In current times, this would rank the region collectively as number 8 in terms of coal production, above Kazakhstan, above Poland, above Ukraine. However, the region, the sector, has experienced a steady decline since the 1960s. The Ruhr's hard coal mines permanently closed in 2018. Saarland always had a much smaller coal footprint, and its operations closed in 2012. Having said that, Germany still has a number of lignite mines operating, and it does plan to cease all operations by 2038. So cease complete coal production by 2038. To help the country plan plan these closures, and to then use drawn past lessons of having closed some hard coal mines. There was a coal commission that was established in 2018. So what you see on the right is the composition. So it had, as you can tell, it had quite a wide range of representation. So a number of stakeholder groups were involved. So it did also have, as you see, there were three members from the parliament. So there were responsible ministries included in the commission, and so but they didn't have any voting rights, and that was really only to keep the outcomes of the transition and the recommendations of the commission quite objective and accountable, and not have politics mixed with the final decisions and recommendations. So this was an independent body comprising 31 members. There were 4 key objectives of the Coal Commission. They were to help Germany achieve its climate targets, ensure domestic security of supply, so an issue around energy security here, keeping electricity affordable, because if these coal mines were feeding coal-fired power plants, and if coal operations ceased, how would it impact Germany's power affordability? Considering now that we know in the backdrop of Russia-Ukraine war, that Germany imports nearly all of its natural gas from overseas. So clearly the energy security and affordability was a key question for German policymakers. And then the final objective for the Coal Commission was to facilitate a just transition for workers and regions that were dependent on these coal industrial activities. Right. So how was it done? What entailed as part, who influenced, and what were the key processes involved in the German coal transition? So one thing I would like to say is that it's quite interesting. The German case is quite interesting because
Dr. Vigya, just a heads up, it's 11:50. That's
right, great, thanks. Thank you, Zinat. So it's interesting to note that Germany's coal decline occurred independently of 2 key nationally significant energy developments. There was a phase out of nuclear energy in 2011, a complete phase out of nuclear energy in 2011, and there was a very strong uptake of renewable energy development driven by improvements in affordability and accessibility. However, those 2 developments did not necessarily lead to a decline in coal use. In fact, Germany has had a long-standing position on the contrary, to sustain coal industry. And therefore, regions hosting coal operations have historically supported the government, providing generous subsidies to the coal sector. Anyway, so the way the German coal transition took place was predominantly through a direct involvement of affected groups. There was a goal-oriented consultation and dialogue process. The idea was to achieve a broad-based societal consensus to avoid conflict. It favored a polycentric approach to governance, so power to the local regions. And there was a legally ratified date. So it basically gave ample time for authorities at the local regional levels to then build up alternatives, to think about co-design transition plans almost from the ground up. There was also a very strong focus on environmental remediation costs. So environmental assessments were thorough, but they were also accounting for future follow-up costs. Early on, a rehabilitation levy was introduced. There was what was known as the Structural Change Fund that was allocated regionally, but controlled provincially. So there was a complete decentralization in how funds were used and dispersed. And obviously there was substantial support for workers in regions, particularly in the Ruhr region. So there are some things that Germany has done well based on that process. It was able to draw synergies amongst key goals, key policy goals. There was a particular focus on soft location factors, and that meant that there was a recognition of the value of the cultural identities in the region that were shaped by the presence of coal, and they were not, and efforts were made to recognize that identity, but also draw on that identity to enhance the cultural value of the region. The focus was very much on creating a knowledge-based society. So moving from a primary and a secondary sector to a tertiary sector that was driven by investments in research and innovation and R&D generally. Alongside the time, the certainty of timing, there was a strong funding commitment, and the two went hand in hand. And as I mentioned earlier, there was inclusive governance and polycentric, in a polycentric style, which allowed decentralized, region-wide coordination, but strongly democratic decision-making. And there were some very strong anticipative elements. There was early communication of phase-out planning. There was early communication of timing of phase-out, of asset phase-outs. And these went hand in hand with strong financial planning that was underpinned with strong funding commitment. Germany's example and experience also demonstrates that economic reorientation worked best when new projects were developed that related to existing industries. So, I would encourage you to go and read a little bit more around what happened in Saarland. But as coal mines closed, there was a strong push from the local and regional government to develop the automotive sector in Saarland. That Saarland's position allowed it to harness its neighbor country, neighbor regions' strengths in the automotive sector. So that allowed Saarland actually some really good infrastructural development. Funding applications were successful to set up large-scale car manufacturing plants, etc. So it was able to reorientate its strong mining culture to settle on a new industry development, in this case, automotive. But that was really not in isolation from what else was happening around it. It was very much harnessing what else was happening around it in terms of physical, regional planning into an automotive sector that it led. It's now there's questions in the literature around whether Saarland as a region has become dependent on the automotive sector, perhaps too much. So again, these are things for us to plan, in India to plan through, that when we are foregoing dependence in one sector, could this invariably lead to dependence in another sector? That's sort of the big criticism that has come through in the literature around Saarland's focus on automotive industry. Right. Talking about the US, so I'm sure many of you have already have read about the long coal industry history in America. So 22 of its 50 states comprise the three main coal regions. The sort of one of the largest coal belts in the US is Appalachia, which is the states of, including the state of West Virginia. So that's the East Coast, sort of Northeast. It covers 8 states, and there are nearly 25 million people living in the region. West Virginia is the region's largest coal producing state and the second largest in the US. In 2017, in West Virginia alone, there were 40,000 people working in the coal mining and coal-fired power sector, and contributed nearly 17% to the state's GDP. As a country, we know that US has had one of the most strong, sort of most influential coal lobbies globally, and that has really shaped its transition experiences, as we'll see. Right. So there were two key reasons for coal decline in the US. The first was the emergence of a cleaner, cheaper source, which in the American case was mostly shale gas, and more recently, a growing share of solar and wind power. Secondly, the second was a steady emergence of a pro-climate group of actors. They were putting pressure on power utilities to source electricity from non-fossil sources. And as a result, that was in turn putting pressure on financiers. So there was a strong divestment from coal that has happened since the early 2000s. As I said, it's got one of the world's strongest coal lobbies, and that led to a depoliticization of coal and the energy sector more broadly. Most recently, it was seen during the Obama administration, where the Clean Power Plan was, it couldn't take off. However, there's very clear evidence and very strong evidence indeed that the coal lobby in the US is weakening. So over the next 2 decades, across its fossil energy sector, so it includes oil, gas, and coal, it is expected, so the estimates vary significantly, but it is expected that over the next 2 decades, up to 1.5 million jobs may be under threat. Now, this is quite significant. This really is important to take into account. So not all of these jobs are in the coal sector, but it's very strongly indicative of the decline in fossil fuel use more generally in the US. So let's just focus on Appalachia, because it's also one of the regions that's most widely studied in the literature. So there are some things that have gone well in Appalachia in terms of experiences with coal phase out. So first of all, local community ties have enabled the uptake and the success of some very strong regional initiatives. Most of these needed a local champion, and most of them focused on job creation. But I would like you to take away the point around a local champion here, because we'll see that that's quite an important takeaway from the US experience generally, that local champions have played a very important role in co-designing these regional initiatives with local communities that has not been seen in many other places. Appalachia also as a region focused very strongly on diversification along a number of fronts. So they were able to foster a soft location value, again, focusing on the culture and the social and natural capital existing within the region. There were efforts to redevelop abandoned buildings into energy efficient properties that led to this facilitation of green construction business. They diversified ex-coal workers into farming and set up many food co-ops. And so the Appalachian region was the one which basically allowed food co-ops to again become fashionable and accessible in the US. One of the things that's quite peculiar about the experiences in Global North have been that coal mining jobs are quite well-paying jobs. So they were able to retrain some of these displaced miners in high-paying jobs, but this is still one of the issues that that still is quite, well, it has remained complicated and has not been quite easy to successfully roll out over the years. There are some things that didn't quite go to plan in Appalachia. And I think it's very important when we're looking at global experiences, it's important to capture successes, but it's perhaps even more important to capture what failed, so we can learn from those failings and make sure that we don't accidentally reinvent the wheel in this case. The Appalachia region has been notoriously known for its health and environmental hazards. There has been some very poor regulation around water, air quality and land quality. There is a significant historical environmental legacy challenge. The Superfund sites are identified by the Environmental Protection Authority in the US, and they are the sites that require quite a long-term rehabilitation and pollution address. So there are more than 400 Superfund sites in Appalachia alone, and the cleanup is all paid for by the taxpayer fund. The other important thing to note from Appalachia's experience is this one-dimensional approach to transition. For over 50 years, an overwhelming focus was on jobs and retraining and reskilling. And even then, it wasn't really able to contain out-migration. So people had to, these jobs were not as high paying as the coal sector, and therefore out-migration became quite a serious challenge. And it was draining out resources from the region. And a number of these failures, for lack of a better word, can be actually attributed to the absence of democratic participation of affected communities. There was sort of very limited grassroots planning. And as I said earlier, these grassroots efforts were predominantly dependent on the local champions. So in regions and in communities where there were not enough local champions, those regions remained outside of, they were not included in the planning process. So it was still quite lean on grounds up and sort of bottom up planning for, post closure. So we're jumping on to Australia now. So just as background for those of you who are not quite familiar with where Australia stands on its coal trajectory, it is the second largest coal exporter in the world after Indonesia. It produces over 500 million tons of coal per year, nearly half of which is used for its own domestic power generation. We still have about 100 operating coal mines and employ sorry, that's a typo. It has to be 40,000, not 400,000, sorry. People employed in the coal mining sector, which is about a fifth of our entire mining employment nationally. So, Australia does have a very strong iron ore mining sector as well. But coal mining provides a fifth of our all mining employment. There is a growing scrutiny on coal consumption for power. There has been a decline. So a number of our coal-fired generators have retired in the last few years, in the last couple of years specifically. A noteworthy example has been the Hazelwood brown coal mine and power station in Victoria near Melbourne in 2017. So these two newspaper clippings that you see on the right are actually from very recent developments. So Australia's largest coal-fired power station, Eraring, this was, I think, announcement was made to close early this year. And Western Australia in the last couple of weeks, which is one of the largest coal mining and the largest iron ore mining state on the west of Australia, has just announced that it's going to shut all state-owned coal plants by 2030. So there is a growing regard for the environment and a greater scrutiny for domestic coal consumption. So I'm just going to, this slide really just talks about, to give you a bit more context about the Hazelwood experience. So the Hazelwood power station was Australia's largest power plant by capacity at the time. It was also the oldest and unfortunately most carbon intensive, so most polluting power plant. It was providing nearly 5% of national electricity and a quarter of Victoria's electricity, so the state in which it's at. It operated for over 50 years, and the decision to close the plant were mostly commercial and driven by commercial concerns. So there was a brief period in which a carbon pricing was introduced. There was the state of Victoria marginally increased the rate for coal royalties. And there was also the need for the plant owners to upgrade and repair infrastructure, which would be costly considering how old the plant was. This was to to meet with the plant's health and safety regulations. So based on these commercial concerns, the decision was taken to basically shut down the plant. Unfortunately, they only gave 5 months notice. in 2017. So in broad terms, Hazelwood has been one of the longest and most expensive decommissioning projects undertaken in Australia's recent history. We are talking about a 30-year timeline for complete rehabilitation and nearly 700 million in Australian dollars, 700 million combined for mine and power station. So it was quite expensive. What you see on the right are two images from sort of our national news, which provide some sense of what's happened to the region since. So the figure on the bottom basically outlines how despite some strong identity attached to coal, there was optimism more widely in the community 2 years after the power station closing. The figure on the top right, there is a battery plant under construction, being built on the site of the former power station. This will be a 150 megawatt battery and will use existing infrastructure at the site to connect to the electricity grid. The Hazelwood closure resulted in the loss of about 750 jobs. But 2 years on, the unemployment rate had been 5.7%. This was down from 8% at the time the plant closed. So, and more than $250 million were provided as a package was provided to help the region adjust. There has been a high-tech precinct being built in the region, which is designed to foster research, product development, and invite other more innovative industries in the region. So again, focus on jobs, but not just jobs, to advance the image of the region just as much. So at Hazelwood, there was, as I said, some very strong financial assistance programs from both the state and federal governments. There was a Latrobe Valley. So this Latrobe Valley was is one of the biggest brown coal reserves. And that's where the Hazelwood power station was situated. The Latrobe Valley has since developed a mine rehabilitation advisory committee, which has led to a rehabilitation strategy. So there's a very strong focus on preserving the ecological integrity of the region. On the right is an image of its key stakeholders and how the regional rehabilitation strategy has a very strong focus on stakeholder consultation and consent. And this is just to give you a sense of how wide these stakeholders are. There's the water industry, there's local and state governments, there is the focus on traditional owners or indigenous peoples. And Victoria is also quite a strong has a strong agricultural community, so focus was on farmers and irrigators, as well as trade unions, etc. However, I must also add that the failure, the underlying failure was mostly because we did not have a roadmap, a national roadmap or a guide sort of document to help close coal industrial facilities. There is in Australia a very strong political lobby that has over the years resulted in high uncertainty in our policy. There has been carbon pricing introduced and then taken off. There has been a constant shift in renewable energy target policymaking. There has been a strong regulatory uncertainty. So Hazelwood has done well, given how uncertain the national landscape is or has been on energy and climate. So most of the government support that has been provided to coal mine closures and coal-fired power plant closures has, at the federal level, has been quite ad hoc and has really come down to how strongly the state in which the facilities are situated are driving it. And this is sort of my final region that I'm sharing today, which is Poland. So Poland, for many of you who may already know, it's It has been Europe's largest hard coal producer for many years. It has 20 active mines and currently has nearly 100,000 people still working in the industry. It also hosts Europe's largest thermal power plant, which is set to be decommissioned in the next decade, or just over a decade. More than 70% of Poland's power is coal-fired, and the coal sector is very strong, including some very strong trade unions. Now, in the past, Poland has been quite successful in targeting region-specific funding to address social impacts from coal mine closure and worker retrenchment. 70% of these funds have been funded, have come from the government budget, while 30% have been supported by the mines. There are mining communes in Poland, and there are special privileges for those mining communes. This has been much in line with what we have in India as the district mineral fund. So they're specifically to be used for those particular local areas where mining is predominant, coal mining in particular. And just recently in 2021, the Polish government and the miners' unions have finally agreed on a long-term contract to close all coal mines by 2049. Now, again, the certainty of that timeline has provided the workers, unions, government, local industry to actually develop a plan, consult broadly as well as locally, broadly at the national level, but also very specific in those mining communes, which are most likely to be impacted as coal mines begin to close to achieve that target of 2049. I just wanted to highlight this one example of revitalization and creative use of existing facilities. It's the city of Gliwice, which initiated a new Gliwice Education and Business Center operating out of restored buildings of a closed mine. Several ex-mining properties were similarly used to boost economic revitalization and of all mining areas, thereby creating quite modern, innovative technology and industrial hubs. A critical element in the success of this example could be attributed or was the close working relationship between local governments, communities, and other local actors, including a number of private entrepreneurs who bought into the idea of reimagining the city and whilst building on the old but important cultural, historical legacy of coal. So obviously there are many of these towns and cities in India, which might be able to draw some of these experiences. So just wrapping up, in terms of key lessons, I would like to propose that there are 4 lessons from these global experiences. The first is around governance. So energy transitions, as we know, are deeply complex and often embedded within quite rigid institutional structures. Good governance provides temporal certainty as well as accountability, and an overarching guidance framework, whilst acknowledging that at the local level, there will be a very strong need to adapt to context. The second lesson I draw from this is around the importance and the significance of inclusive engagement with a particular focus and process. So engagement and dialogue with those affected, including a variety of stakeholders, identifying gatekeepers, identifying local champions, and enabling bottom-up capability building. The third is around embedding within our plans a focus that extends beyond jobs. So this is an issue that has noted least success in past experiences. Creating jobs and just going by the quantity of jobs is not the end all and be all. It's necessary, but clearly insufficient. There has to be, a number of a large sort of section of the US Appalachian region. There is still evidence of widespread social and economic decline in these communities because of outmigration, because the focus was strongly on creating number of jobs, not necessarily even looking at the quality of jobs created. this is beginning to change, and this idea of creating more than just jobs is being recognized. So the Reclaim Act, which was introduced in the US House of Representatives in 2019, is a good example of the recognition of the idea of a just transition, and to be able to create livable cities and communities that offer a good, a high standard of living that extends beyond simply employment. And then the final issue that to me stood out from looking at these, studying and researching these lessons and these experiences, was the alignment with existing policies. It is very important that energy transition or coal phase out does not stand in isolation from what else matters for that particular region. So creating synergies between energy transition and key national priorities is important. It advances on, advances the agenda of energy transition at many levels. The Australian example is a case in point where there was strong misalignment between what the state government wanted to achieve and lack of support from the federal level. Again, unlike Germany, Australia's overall lack of recognition of a climate emergency actually prevented closures in the coal sector from informing future transition pathways. So those are just some of the lessons from these global experiences. I haven't purposefully covered the UK, but I'm very happy to get in touch, and I invite any questions on that. But just I wanted to raise this at the very end. So this is with Pradeep, we are hoping to organize a workshop around social aspects of mine closure in India. We're looking to invite a number of bureaucrats from coal states, but also from other states which host power stations and depend on this on a sort of secure coal supply. We're also looking at the supply chain of coal. So we're looking at inviting representatives from sectors that are dependent on coal, truck drivers, so transportation sector, railways, and we're looking at both private and public stakeholders. So yeah, so we are hoping to hold this workshop in sometime in November this year at the Just Transition Research Center. And I'm hoping that many of you would be keen to participate and help us think through a little bit better. That's it, I guess. Zeenat, I'm done.